As some of you may know, I had the awesome opportunity a few weeks ago to drive an ARCA race car at the home of motorsports, World Center of Speed, Daytona International Speedway in Daytona Beach, Florida. It was an awesome experience, had a great time. It was for the ARCA two-day test as part of the ARCA Menard series. Got to do some solo runs and a little bit of drafting, so not much. The average lap speeds were about 176 miles an hour, and it was my first time driving a stock car at Daytona. I do have other racing experience. I've done dirt track racing before. I've also done a little bit of road racing, which you've seen on this channel when I raced with Battle Scarred Motorsports. If you're really new to the channel, I'm a fighter pilot. I've flown the F-16 and the F-18, and most recently the T-38A as an adversary pilot. Not currently flying anything right now. In training, I flew the T-6, T-38. I've also flown the L-39. So I've got a little bit of experience in both. And when I did the video on driving the race car, what was interesting was the response and the comments. And some people were like, you know, really slowing down, huh, mover? Or not enough adrenaline, or kind of an adrenaline change, or, you know, just comparing the two. And I thought it'd be interesting to actually go through and compare what it was like driving a race car around Daytona versus a career flying fighters.
3, 2, 1, fight off.
So right off the bat, the first thing people talked about was adrenaline. And I think people think that I'm an adrenaline junkie because I do stuff like that. And I will say that is absolutely false. And I only speak for myself. I don't know about other fighter pilots or race car drivers or anything like that. But for me, the only time I get an adrenaline dump or an adrenaline rush is if I'm on fire.
Oh my God, help me, I don't want to die. Oh, stop, drop, and roll.
You're not on fire, Ricky Bobby.
I'm on fire.
If something is going wrong, if I'm like, oh man, I really dodged a bullet there, I could have died. Typically, when I fly a jet or drive a race car, it's focus. You're focused on what you're doing, the task, the immediate task, the next task, and even the next task after that. You know, in a jet, you could be doing beyond visual range stuff and you're trying to work the radar, or you're trying to stay in formation, or you're trying to get the system set up to drop a bomb, or when you're rolling in to drop a bomb, you're focused on getting the parameters right. Or in dogfighting, you're maneuvering in relation to the bandit, to the adversary. When you're driving a race car, it's the same thing. For me, it's a sense of zen. Everything else kind of fades away in the race car, and I'm just focused on lap times, hitting your marks, trying to race cleanly with the other cars, you know, not wrecking, stuff like that. The only time I get an adrenaline rush in either of those things is if something is either a near miss or something goes horribly wrong. You really don't want adrenaline. I mean, like, again, I'm not speaking for other people, but if you've ever read On Combat with Lieutenant Colonel Grossman or any of those books, you realize that when you start getting adrenaline and you start getting amped up, your heart rate increases. And as your heart rate increases, you start to lose a little bit of fine motor skills. So for performance, you actually want to keep your heart rate down and you want to stay as calm as possible. And for that, pretty much across the board, not much adrenaline, again, unless something's going wrong. Is it fun? Hell yeah. Do you look back and go, man, that was a good time? Do you feel like you've had a workout? Yeah. And I'll talk about the physical aspects here in a second. But as far as adrenaline goes, not really either. The second thing people talk about is sensation of speed. So that's a real common comment because, you know, the fastest I've ever gone in an aircraft is Mach 1.86, 800 knots. And I've done, you know, 540, 600 knots low altitude, but Mach was all high altitude. So they're like, well, you go from flying Mach 2 to, you know, 175, 180 miles an hour. It's a big difference, right? You feel like you're walking. I will say that for me, it doesn't matter what I'm driving. It doesn't matter where I'm flying. It's a focus. And if I go fly the helicopter, which, you know, is not a very fast thing, you know, 80 to 110 knots or even hovering versus flying the T-38. I did that a lot a couple years ago when I was in training for the helicopter. I would go back and forth. I'd fly the T-38, you know, one day, and then a couple days later, I'd fly the helicopter. And for me, my mind just automatically shifts. There's no, oh God, this is slow. It just adapts to whatever it is that I'm doing. But in general, speed is relative. So when you fly supersonic, I did a whole video on what it's like to break the sound barrier. There's really no indication. There's nothing relative. There's nothing around you unless there's like clouds where you're like cloud surfing or something like that. There's no sensation of speed. The only thing that tells you broke the number is your gauge. That's it. Your airspeed indicator. It's a little bit of movement as you break through, transonic to supersonic. After that, you really don't know. It's really cool when you slow down, throw the boards, get all the drag out. You can actually, move forward in your seat. But as far as speed being relative, not really. In low level, you do get more of a sensation of speed because you see trees and stuff like that. But even then, you're at 200 feet. There's not much of a, nothing's rushing by you. I think the closest you get is like ridge crossings, flying over mountains, because then you kind of, you roll inverted and you see, okay, there's stuff flying by. But even then, it's very smooth. Even though it looks kind of rough, it's not exactly violent. I did say that about driving race cars, that it's violently fast because it's raw. And so you get a lot more forces, which I'll talk about the G forces here in a second, but you get a lot more forces when you're driving the car because you've got the grip from the tires, you've got the acceleration from the engine, the torque, the horsepower, all that stuff. And because you're closer to the ground, you do get more of a sensation of speed, especially as you get closer to the wall. But even race cars, it's the same thing. You do a couple laps, you're not really feeling like you're going that fast anymore because you get kind of used to it because speed is relative. There's no sensation that you're really hauling. I think the people that have the greatest sensation of speed are like the shifter carts, the go-karts, because they're really low to the ground, they're going really fast relative to what they're doing. When I flew the helicopter low level with Lester and we flew like levees and stuff like that, you do get a greater sensation of speed because treetops are above you and you're flying, 10, 15 feet off the ground at 80, 90 miles an hour, and that gives you that bigger sensation of speed. So it's not fair to be like, oh, you're slowing down. Well, yes, raw numbers, you're slowing down, but as far as what you feel, the race car, you're always going to feel like you're going faster because you're closer to the ground. There's more stuff relative to you. Now, when you're in a pack of other cars, now you're back to it doesn't feel like you're going fast because you're relative to the other car. It's just a relative feeling. The next thing is G-forces. So yes, flew the F-16, right? Most Gs have ever pulled 9.8, hurt like a big dog. You do pull a lot of Gs flying fighters, but you have to understand how G-forces work, right? There's different axes for how you pull Gs, right? GX, GY, GZ. So the Y-axis, the X-axis, and the Z-axis. When we talk about flying fighters, you're talking primarily in the Z-axis. Okay, so that's God's G. That's right now I'm sitting here, 1G, 1 times the force of gravity, which means, you're sitting here, you weigh whatever it is you weigh normally. As you start to increase bank, increase lift, increase your pull, you increase that G up to 9, so 9 times the force of gravity, but it all is vertical. That is bad because G-forces create pooling of your blood. Your blood's, as you sit here, your circulatory system is used to pumping blood in a certain direction. When you pull positive Gs, it tries to pool the blood at your feet, which is why we wear G-suits that help. When you G-strain, you press against that, it inflates. It helps with your thighs, your quads, your legs, get your core activated, and you do every 3 seconds an air exchange, and you try to get that blood flow back to your brain. Conversely, if you're doing negative Gs, it really sucks because there's not a whole lot you can do. You can't G-strain negative Gs, so you get into a red-out situation because all the blood's going to your head. So that's why we can't pull Gs as long when we're in the negative G. But that's really all you talk about when you talk about flying fighters is positive, negative Gs. Raptors and like Su-57s and stuff that can do pedal turns, and those start to talk about the Y-axis, different axis for flying or for pulling Gs. You're not talking about lateral grip or anything like that. When you drive a race car, now, when I was going around the turn at Daytona, turn 1 and 2, we actually did the math. T-Bear and his wife, thank you for doing that, by the way, if you're watching, did the math, and it's about 1.69, they round here, 1.69 positive Gs, but also about a G.5 lateral Gs, that is where it's different because you feel that in the car. And it's an insane amount of grip. You feel like, man, I'm surprised this car is sticking because it laterally is pushing against you, but it's also because you're banked and you're accelerating under the force of gravity and you're turning, you also get some z-axis G's, so some God's G as well. 1.5 G's. 1.5 G's in a level turn, that's like 45 degrees of bank, maybe 50 degrees of bank. I don't have the chart, but that's a level turn. It's not much in an aircraft, if you look at the chart, 60 degrees of bank would be 2 G's to maintain level flight, the amount of lift required to maintain level flight. So it's really not, but 31 degrees of banking, pulling 1.5 G's. So when you talk about overall G's, yes, it's a lot less to drive a race car. And I know we've talked about this in the mover mailbag, formula would be, 6 G's in lateral, they spike or whatever, but it's lateral G's. I don't know what they're pulling as far as you'd have to do the math, but they're not pulling like 9 G's. They're not pulling a z-axis G's that they're having to G-strain and worry about, G-locking. A lot of it is vertigo, vestibular problems, stuff where the brain is actually shifting because of, it's laterally. But that's a whole aerospace physiology question by itself. So you've got those forces as well. And you can feel that in the car. When you're driving, you're in a containment seat, you're trying to stay centered versus in a fighter, you have different support equipment. You don't have a containment seat or an ejection seat, but you're trying to maintain consciousness while you're pulling all those G's. So the other difference between the two, I think from a fitness and endurance perspective, the best way I can relate this is a fighter pilot is more like an MMA fighter, and a race car driver would be more like a marathon runner. Yes, you pull fewer forces, but you're doing it for 3 hours. You're doing it for 2 hours. You're doing it for a lot longer. When you go out and dogfight in a fighter jet, you pull 9 G's, but you're pulling 9 G's for like 30 seconds and then back off. It's ramping up, ramping down, ramping up, ramping down, because 4 G's here, 5 G's here. The average dogfight lasts a couple minutes at most and rightfully so. Number one, it doesn't last long because the fuel. You're an afterburner a lot, so somebody's going to, what they call fuel mort, if they don't shoot the other person down. You just can't last that long, so to speak. Also, if you're in a dogfight that's that prolonged, somebody's wingman's going to come in and pop the guy that's, not doing their best dogfighting. That's just the way it is. So you don't want dogfighting and engagements to last long. When you're flying fighters, yes, I've done 6-7 hour missions, but they're not 6-7 hour missions pulling 9 G's. The only time we ever pull a lot of G's is dogfighting. Other than that, 2 G's, 3 G's, maybe 4 G's. You got to remember these longer sorties are for dropping bombs, typically, or doing a combat air patrol or something. So it's a lot of time where you're just sitting there. You're working sensors, you're working systems, talking on the radio. You may go in, roll in, drop a bomb, 5 G's in 2 seconds. You roll off for safe escape, and then you come back and you do it again. But it's not this continuous. Versus driving a race car, let's talk the Daytona 500, for example, which is a 3.5 hour race, depending on cautions and stuff like that. If it's a long green flag run, you're talking 20, 30, maybe even an hour of continual going around the corner, G.5 in the z-axis, a G.5 laterally. It's not 9, but it's that continuous. It's a continuous stress, which that takes a physical toll on your body, and it's in a hot car. In the car that I was in, the oil was right behind you, so you're talking 180 degrees right there. There's no airflow in the cockpit. There's no air conditioner in the cockpit. There's no, other than the cooling air in your helmet, there's no creature comforts. Versus a fighter, every fighter I've ever flown, and I think pretty much all of them, have some kind of climate control system. They have to. So you have heat and you have air conditioning. And they usually work pretty well. Sometimes they don't, but usually pretty well. Because you're in a solarium, so it would suck if it didn't. But for the most part, you're pretty comfortable. In a race car, you're hot, you're dehydrated, and you're physically exerting yourself around the track for 3 hours. And that's just if you were by yourself. Now add other cars where you add the mental part. And the mental part's what really wears you down for either of them. Mentally flying fighters, that is hugely what it is to fly fighters, because you're constantly, if you're defending a point, like a 4VX, you're defending a point, you're having to come up with a game plan, you're having to talk to other agencies, you're having to do all this work. If you're dropping bombs, you're looking at the fusing, you're looking at weapons effects. You're talking to a JTAC who may be stressed. You're trying to get the information from the 9-line. There's a lot of mental effort, and that is the biggest part of this. Same thing with driving race cars. People say, well, it's, it's a redneck sport or whatever, but it's really not. You are working your strategy. You're working with your crew chief to try to decide, okay, what is the car doing? How do I relate? And this is where the successful race car drivers make their money, because they can communicate what the car is doing to the crew chief and maintenance, and they can make adjustments to make the car better and make it faster and easier to drive. Because the easier the car is to drive, the less physical exertion that they have to put into it, and the less they wear down tires, the less the car fades on long runs. And then you talk about fuel strategy. So there's a lot of strategy that goes in. Where am I going to run on the track? Where am I going to run in relation to these other people? Am I going to try to pass on this lap? Am I going to bump draft them? Am I going to stay farther back in the draft because I don't want to, this guy is going to wreck me? There's a lot of strategy that goes in, even though people say, well, hey, you just go fast and turn left. And even more so if you talk road courses, because now you're not only fighting the other cars, but now you're fighting the track. And when you talk, IMSA and endurance racing and stuff like that, now you've got rain, weather conditions, all that stuff. I think NASCAR next year is going to actually start running in the weather, which is going to be crazy. But there's a lot physically and mentally to both jobs. I just think it's different. One is high intensity intervals, which is a fighter pilot, because of, you're only pulling G's for a little bit. You're never pulling G's for a really long time. But it wears you down over time, like a fighter, like an MMA fighter. And then a race car driver, where it's always the same, it's always the same amount of force. And then road courses, it could be, it's all lateral G's, but it's still enough that you're, now you're using your core to try to stay in the seat, and you're tired, and, it's been a long run, and you're just trying to stay focused. So there's a lot going on, both physically and mentally, for both aspects. So that's just a small look into kind of a comparison. There's a lot more to it. There are a lot more aspects to it. Obviously, I'm not super experienced as a race car driver. I'm very experienced as a fighter pilot. So I'm new to the racing world, and I'm not even saying I'm going to be a race car driver. It's just I got to do something cool, and it was a lot of fun. But it was enough for me to be able to come back and go, here are the differences. Here's why, it's not just, oh, well, you're going a lot slower, it should be easy, or here's why, it's no big deal, because they're both very demanding physically and mentally in their own ways, and they're both a lot of fun. I mean, I recommend both to anybody that wants to do it. Now, if you're asking me which career to choose, well, racing is very tough. You're an elite athlete, so it's very tough at the highest levels to get into. Being a fighter pilot, it's more of a make them tell you no. I think you've got more of a chance. Be a fighter pilot, race on the side, race for fun, than you do driving race cars and flying fighters for fun. Because if you're going to fly anything as a fighter for fun, I mean, the amount of money it takes to go and, fly, because a lot of people say L-39, but you're really talking, something much more expensive than that, even T-38 or beyond, to really get the experience of being a fighter pilot, which I will say also, we've talked about this also before, fighter pilots aren't just people who fly fighters. It's a mentality. You have to be able to employ the fighter jet to kill people and break their things. I mean, that's the job of being a fighter pilot, just like race car drivers. You're not a race car driver if you just go do test days like I did, or open lapping days, or, just the mess around at the track and you pass people every now and then on a high performance driver's education. You're a race car driver if you race. And the racing craft is what separates the professional race car drivers from guys like me at this point, because now you're using, there's a psychological aspect to it. You're trying to convince people that you're either faster than you are, or you're not as fast as you are, because you're playing some games, to intimidate people, or to make them underestimate you, or to surprise them. I mean, there's a lot of other stuff that goes on that I discovered. I'm like, man, this is not just, hey, let's just get in the car, go fast, turn left. There's just a lot more to it. And it was a really cool opportunity to do it, and I really hope that I do get that opportunity. If you haven't seen those videos, check it out on Life with Mover. They've done fairly well. I'm actually surprised, and I'm really happy about that. And we're still looking for sponsors if anybody's interested in jumping on board, and hopefully we'll be able to go racing and actually be race car drivers and not just a guy who did a test at Daytona. But either way, incredibly fortunate. Thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. I'll see you next time.